All right. Let's go ahead and find our seats, and we'll start Revelation chapter 13, part 2. So, all right, good morning. As I said, we'll continue chapter 13. But before we do that, let's have a prayer. Heavenly Father, we're thankful for another morning that you've given us. We're thankful for the ability, physical ability to be here, that our health is in such good stead that we can wake up and be here in good health. And please help us not to take that for granted. Please help us as we study this portion of your word. We're thankful for it. And please help us above all to be more like Jesus. In his name we pray. Amen. All right, I want to start a little bit differently this morning because the subject matter this morning is some of the most well-known in the book of Revelation. I remember a few years ago, I was at a grocery store, and there was someone in front of me, and the total that she got was $6.66. And she said, "No, I'll buy something else. I don't want that number." And you know, we might find that a little bit humorous, but some people, therefore, take it very seriously. And that is, as you know, and if you don't know, hopefully you will pretty soon, that is the mark of the beast. And it has fascinated people for centuries, I suppose, since the book was first written. And what is it? Who is the beast? And of course, this gets mixed together with this idea of the Antichrist, and then it becomes, well, who is the Antichrist? And that figure has been identified, I would say, misidentified in many different ways for years and years. People thought, for example, that it was a specific pope of the Catholic Church. Obviously, Protestants thought that. And then it became, for us, U.S. presidents. You think of a president, and that person has probably been referred to as the Antichrist by somebody, okay? So this, and it's all surrounding this passage. What do we do with this part of Revelation 13? And I think part of the reason I wanted to tell you that story is because it shows two things. Number one, how fascinating this puzzle is of chapter 13, and but also the difficulty. If you can think of so many, just off the top of your head, identifiers or referents for the Antichrist, and then the 666 along with it, that probably means it's not straightforward, and it's not. Whatever we conclude about it, it isn't straightforward, and hopefully that will become clear. So if you want to know, where do people get this fascination with Revelation generally, but more specifically with this notion of 666, the Antichrist? This is it. It is this passage that we're about to look at. All right, so before we get in, I want to summarize the sea beast, because obviously the beast from the sea and the land beast that we're going to talk about this morning are very much related, and it's not just because they're in the same chapter. They're related as the text makes very clear. Okay, so let me summarize the sea beast. Probably represents the Roman Empire generally, but the Roman emperor specifically. And already you might be thinking, well, how can this symbolize the Roman Empire at the same time as it does the Roman emperor? Because they're not the same thing. And that, I think, is a reminder that precision, as we might like it, is just not an interest here. The text isn't interested in being that precise. It's symbolic. And symbols, by definition, or by their nature, are imprecise. So we're going to look at another imprecision here in just a minute. But what I want you to think is, that's okay. It doesn't have to be precise. And when we want it to be, and if we force it on the text, then I don't think we're being fair to the text. All right? So, that beast represents the Roman Empire. generally, and the emperor specifically. What's clear, the dragon gives the beast his power. The dragon is Satan, right? And then people worshiped the beast as well. But the worship here is more specifically aligned with the beast from the land. All right? So let's now, what does the text say about the land beast? Well, it exercises authority over the first beast. Or not over, but of, right? So in other words, it's part of this beast. They have a relationship. It also makes people of the earth worship the first beast. And that includes the image. We'll talk about what that means specifically here in just a little bit. And it also causes everyone to be marked on the hand and the forehead. And what that does is that allows them to buy and sell. So what does that mean? If you don't have this stamp, then you can't buy and sell. Your economic ability, I guess we could say, is going to be severely limited if you do not have these marks. All right? So what is it? Let's just get this out of the way. I think it's probably the imperial cult. All right? It might be something slightly different. Some have argued that this could be just the imperial priesthood as a whole, which includes the imperial cult, but also includes what we might consider to be more traditional associations of Greco-Roman religion. But I think the emperor cult, if it's not exactly that, it's pretty close. In other words, it's some religious body within the Roman Empire. But me even saying that is a little bit anachronistic. And what I mean by that is to separate the Roman Empire into like a political and a religious divisions, completely artificial, completely modern. Well, they would not do that. But for the sake of basicness, easiness, I'll just do it that way. Anyway, probably the imperial cult. That's what I'm trying to say. All right. Well, what was the imperial cult? We've talked about this before, but I want to reiterate it since this is such an important part of Romans, Revelation 13. It was dedicated to deceased and deified emperors. Okay, deceased emperors, but also emperors that were deified. Right, they were made into gods after their death. That's typically what happened. Now, in the provinces, devotees could worship living emperors. Are we talking about churches in a province? Yes, we are. So that's an important feature of imperial worship that may not necessarily be a feature of imperial worship in Italy or in the city of Rome. Dee asked a very good question last time, and that is, how much did the Romans themselves actually believe this about the emperor, right? When they worshipped the emperor. And obviously we don't have exact answers for that, and I would imagine it differs from person to person, just like that's just how people are, right? They're complicated. So I think it's probably more about, because I did some more reading about this, and I think it's probably more about admiration or obligation than sincere worship. Right? So in other words, if we were called upon, and we weren't Christians obviously, we were called upon to worship the emperor, to honor the emperor, and so we have to go down, let's say, to the town center, and we have to offer a couple of sacrifices and hear the priest say a couple of prayers maybe. Okay, we'll do that as our duty as a good citizen. But does that mean we actually believe the emperor is God in some sense and that he's going to do something on a cosmic scale that's going to rescue or improve the Roman Empire? Maybe not, right? So it's more about obligation and admiration. You could pay your respects. I mean, after all, that's the propaganda they wanted, is that the emperor was the benefactor to everybody, right? So you could appreciate that, but not really worship. Okay, that's probably the case here. On the right, you have an early first century depiction of an emperor basically being deified. And if you remember, I quoted this, or I mentioned this last time. There's this statement, I'm pretty sure Suetonius records it, about the emperor Claudius in the first century. And it said that on his deathbed, he says, "See, I'm becoming a god," right? Which is a joke, and he probably didn't really say that, but it does illustrate just how typical that was, to assume that when an emperor died, he was going to become a god. So that's what the imperial cult had to do with. And again, I think that's what's in the background here, or I guess you could say not in the background. That's what's up front here in this text. All right, so let's get specific. Let's read the text. Verse 11, "Then I saw another beast that rose out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon." Remember I said the imagery from earlier in 13 is probably Daniel 7. I think it still is here, or at least it would remind the readers of Daniel 7, as it might us. And it spoke like a dragon. What does that probably mean? Anybody have an idea?
It looked as if it was gentle, but its acts were that of a dragon.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's legitimate. What else might be? What else might we infer about that description? Yeah, I think that's it. I think that's, in addition to what he said, I think what he said is absolutely correct. It seems gentle, but actually it's ferocious. But why is it ferocious? Well, because it has Satan behind it, right? Remember, we've already identified the dragon. Pretty easy to do that, okay? It exercises all the authority of the first beast on its behalf, and it makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast. Now, here's the imprecision that I mentioned earlier. Worship the first beast whose mortal wound had been healed. Does anybody remember the description earlier in chapter 13 of the sea beast and its mortal wound? Where was it? Anybody remember? It was one of its heads, right? Now, would it be completely accurate to say that the beast itself as a whole had a mortal wound? No, just one of its heads did, right? So it's not quite what we would expect. But again, that's okay. That's expected when you're talking about something that's so highly symbolic, right? So it's not a problem. But does anybody remember what that mortal wound on that one head, what did that represent? Anybody remember? Because that's going to come back up a little bit later. Yeah, good. Nero. Nero lives again, basically, which, as I said last time, was something that so many sources talk about as a possibility. He was such a charismatic and polarizing leader that he had people that hated him, of course. I think probably a lot of people that hated him, but you also had some people who thought that he was just this transcendent figure, and people like that can't die. And so they thought he was still alive, or he was going to come back again, even though he had died. Not and or, but or, right? He would come back. So that's the Nero Redivivus or Redivivus myth, and that's what 12 is about. Not only that, it says in verse 13, presumably this beast, right, performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in the sight of all. And by the signs that it is allowed to perform on behalf of the beast, it deceives the inhabitants of earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that's been wounded by the sword and yet lived. Okay, so look at that second description of verse 14. This mortal wound now, it says it was caused by the sword. How did Nero die? He committed suicide with a sword. So I think that's even further confirmation that that's what this mortal wound is referring to. It's referring to Nero and this idea that Nero is coming back. And to make it more explicit, maybe for those that weren't here, that's Domitian, because there is at least one source which connects the two and basically says the new Nero is here. It's Domitian, right? Which would fit with the date of the book. Okay, so these signs, these miracles. Verse 13, fire coming down from heaven to earth. I mean, that sounds like some descriptions of miracles in the Bible, but it also was something that, there's this book about interpretation of dreams, and it says the thing that you don't want to dream about is fire coming down from heaven, because that's like the worst thing that could possibly happen, within that framework, and so maybe it's referring to that he can do signs, even the worst kind, maybe. All right, so it says it deceives the inhabitants of the earth. And that could mean that these signs aren't real, that these miracles are fake. But it could also not say anything about that, and merely just saying that through these signs, people are deceived. To me, that seems like that's probably more what he's getting at. What about these miracles? Well, this fits with a lot of other texts where you have what I've referred to here as eschatological antagonists. So what does that mean? These are people who are going to come about at some point during the eschaton, during the final age, right? And they're going to be in opposition to God's people. Jesus talks about this in Matthew 24, 23 to 25, where false prophets, they're going to perform miracles. 2 Thessalonians 10, 9 and 10, the man of lawlessness will also perform signs. Who's the man of lawlessness? Not going to talk about that. So then there's another early Christian text called the Didache. If you've ever heard of the collection, the Apostolic Fathers, this is in that collection. Some scholars date part of the Didache. It's a composite work, so different parts are dated to different eras. But scholars date the earliest part to, some of them date it to the 60s. If that's true, that predates nearly every New Testament book that we have. Which shouldn't, there's nothing to bother us about that, but it is, I think, some of it at least, is pretty early. Right? Well, whatever it is, this is what it says about this theme of eschatological antagonists. Because iniquity abounds, they shall hate each other, persecute each other, deliver each other up, and then shall the deceiver of the world, presumably that's Satan, right, appear as the Son of God, and shall do signs and wonders, and the earth shall be delivered into his hands, and he shall do unlawful things such as have never happened since the beginning of the world. Here, he will appear as the Son of God could also be another reference, like we've seen in Revelation, to this idea that the emperor thought he was the Son of God. That would make sense here. So what he's saying is Satan will work through an emperor, which sounds very much like what we have in Revelation. So this idea that this beast will perform some sort of miracle is stated in these other texts as well. It fits very well with that motif. All right? So, then it says to make an image for the beast that had been wounded by the sword and yet lived. All right? So, then, in verse 15, all right, so we got this idea of making an image. It says it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast could even speak and cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. Also, it causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy and sell who does not have the mark, that is, the name of the beast or the number of his name. And then we have this very famous verse, perhaps the most well-known verse in all of Revelation, verse 18, this calls for wisdom. Let anyone with understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a person. Its number is 666. All right, so before we get to verse 18, what does it mean when it says give breath to the image of the beast? All right, so this is idol worship, right? That's what this is talking about. But idols don't live. What he's saying is he's actually going to give life to the idol. What a strange concept. So to understand this, I think we need to back up a little bit and just talk about idolatry in antiquity generally, but we're more interested in idolatry in the Greco-Roman world. There are passages, as some of you know for sure, in the Old Testament, they talk about how when people worship idols, they're basically worshiping stones. They're worshiping sticks. Some scholars have said these prophets, they don't understand that these idols are actually representative of the gods. And no, I think either they're saying that because they don't think those gods exist, or they're just making a parody of it, or both, right? So that's irrelevant, I guess, to us. But let's ask this question. What did people in the Greco-Roman world think they were doing when they worshipped idols? Because idol worship seems so strange to me. I don't know about you, but it seems very strange. And do you know why I think it seems so strange to me? Because it's just not a part of our culture generally. As you know, there are other cultures in the world. I mean, think about Hinduism in India. People still worship idols, right? So it wouldn't be so strange to talk about it maybe in a culture like that. But we've been so influenced by this Judeo-Christian concept that if you worship God, you don't worship idols, right? And so again, it's strange for us to think about it. But so let's examine this question then. What about in the Greek and Roman world? What was it like? Well, if you look to the left here, this is a statement from Plato. And again, we have to be careful about using sources like this because what sort of people wrote texts in antiquity? Really educated people, right? Did they represent everybody? No, they don't. I mean, does Plato, as a philosopher, does he represent most people in the Greek world and the Roman world? I don't think so. So just because he says something doesn't mean that's what everybody thinks. But when he says something, that's what some people thought, right? So what does Plato say? He says, we set up statues as images. And when we worship these, though they are lifeless. By the way, just as an aside, the word translated lifeless here is I guess you could say the opposite of the word in Revelation when it says to give life to idols, right? In other words, the same root. This is just the negation of the word that you see in Revelation. Anyway, they are lifeless. Plato says there's nothing to these images in themselves, right? The living gods beyond feel a tremendous amount of goodwill and gratitude towards us. So he says, when we worship these idols, we know they're not anything I guess you could say, and maybe he would say in terms of their actual being, right? Their ontological status is not, right? Maybe we could say it that way. But the gods who do truly exist, they get something out of it. That's what he's saying. All right? Now, by the way, on the right, this is it's referred to as lores is the plural, but these are guardian gods and goddesses that people would have in their homes in the Roman world. And so these images would have been everywhere, even in their homes, right? And so what you thought about that image might change significantly if you thought like Plato, or if you thought like Plutarch mentions here. Plutarch wrote a work on Isis and Osiris. Anyway, he says, there are some among the Greeks who've not learned nor habituated themselves to speak of the bronze, the painted, and the stone effigies as statues of the gods and dedications in their honor, but they call them gods. And then they have the effrontery to say that Lachares stripped Athena, that Dionysius sheared Apollo. What he's talking about in these examples, he's talking about when people desecrated idols, right? So in other words, when Dionysius sheared Apollo of the gold, he's talking about Dionysius shearing a statue, an idol, not something that would have happened like in their midst. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about with an idol. Jupiter Capitolinus was burned and destroyed in the Civil War. Thus, they unwittingly take over and accept the vicious opinions that they are the concomitants of the names. You could tell by the tone that Plutarch has. He's very skeptical or even antagonistic toward this belief. He doesn't think that for sure. All right, so here's another idea then. There were some people apparently in the Greco-Roman world who really did believe that these statues not just represented, but somehow embodied the gods and goddesses with which they were associated, right? So it's a different view. So in Revelation, then, like we were seeing, maybe that represents more what people would have thought about the activity of the beast. Maybe that's what I'm trying to say. Now, let me go back, just so we have this in mind. It was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast. Now, I think that statement implies that there was no life, because when it says give breath, it really doesn't just mean so that it could speak, but also so that it has life. So basically, this image is speaking. This statue is speaking. Like I said, it's a really weird idea. Okay, but there are accounts in antiquity of statues speaking, of idols speaking, and there are even specific formulae or rituals you could do to evoke oracles out of a particular image or statue, right? Like Dionysius of Halicarnassus says, he's writing 1st century, both statues had been set up. He's just talking about these random statues, doesn't matter for us. Set up together on the first day of the dedication of the temple. One of them, the one which the women had provided, uttered some words in Latin in a voice both distinct and loud when many were present. The meaning of the words when translated is as follows: "You've conformed to the holy law of the city, matrons, in dedicating me," dedicating the statue. The women who were present were very incredulous. What does incredulous mean? Yeah, they had a hard time believing it, or they didn't believe it, right? So they didn't really believe it, because it says very incredulous. As usually happens in the case of unusual voices and sights, believing that it was not the statue that spoken, but some human voice, and those particular who happened at the moment to have their mind on something else and did not see what it was that spoke, showed this incredulity toward those who had seen it. So not only were these women who heard this, well, they didn't believe it. So these other people that maybe had their mind on something else and didn't quite see what was going on, they didn't believe it either. Okay, so it's interesting that he presents this account, but I would assume Dionysius is also skeptical, as these people who actually heard it were, right? Okay, but so we've got people who were skeptical of this, but we've got other people who believe it a little bit more. So this is in the Hermetic literature. The Hermetic literature are about this guy, Hermes Trismegistos, thrice great Hermes, which is a combination of Egyptian and Greek religion, and it becomes a mystical religion later on, very influential. We don't have time to go into that, but it is really interesting. Anyway, in one of those texts, it says, I mean statues, but statues living and conscious, filled with the breath of life. That's very close to Revelation 13. And doing many mighty works, statues which have foreknowledge and predict future events by the drawing of lots and by prophetic inspiration and by dreams and in many other ways, statues which inflict diseases and heal them. So Revelation says that not only are people going to worship these idols, this idol is going to come alive and give oracles, just like in the text we just saw. Now, I would presume, of course, they were doing it. They were tricking people. And there are accounts in the Greco-Roman world of people being tricked by things like this. Okay? Not all of them, but at least a few of them. Okay? So, I hope that's clear what's going on in 15. Now, here's the other big question other than verse 18 about this passage. It causes everybody. That's what verse 16 is. Everybody. Doesn't matter your social class, doesn't matter your economic situation, everybody. Everybody has to be marked on the right hand or the forehead, so no one can buy and sell without it, basically. What does this mean? It would be really neat if we could point to a cultural practice that this had a parallel. There's just nothing there. One scholar, been a long time ago, he's proposed that, well, actually in Ephesus, in the marketplace, you had to have a stamp on your hand to like get in. I think it would be the equivalent of like if you went to a fair or something, you know, when you go in, you have to have your hands, maybe something like that, right? That's a really interesting hypothesis. There's no evidence for it, though. So we can't really go with that, right? So I'm not sure. I think whatever it might mean exactly, it's a parallel to what else in Revelation? Can anybody think of a parallel in Revelation that we've talked about so far to this idea? Anybody know what I'm asking? Okay, let me make it a little clearer. Any other time in Revelation has there been the statement that somebody was marked in a way like this? Yeah, good. Exactly. 144,000 are marked on the forehead. Why were they marked? Anybody remember? So they would be preserved, right? They wouldn't receive or be inflicted with these punishments. This is like the opposite. So whatever it might have meant culturally, it's at least that. Some people have said, well, you know, this notion of being stamped, maybe it has something to do with the coin. I mean, it's the forehead and the arm. That just doesn't work. Again, this is one of those passages that modern interpreters have really gone wild with, and they think, well, maybe this is like some barcode. Now, and you know what? Maybe we might talk to people who would go with that interpretation. We may not be convinced of that. All right? That's fine. But what sort of argument would we make with somebody that had that interpretation? Because you can't just say, oh, that's dumb, I don't think it's right. I mean, that's like internet kind of conversations. They don't get anywhere. It's pointless, a waste of time, right? I'm not saying all internet conversations are like that, but a lot of them are, right? So what would be an argument? Can anybody think of an argument if someone says, yeah, this is talking about a barcode that's going to happen in the future? Can anybody think of an argument against that? And again, not trying to be disrespectful, not trying to be judgmental, but I don't think that is the best way to interpret the text. Anybody have an argument for that? Well, let me ask another question. Does it matter? No. It doesn't matter. I think it does matter. Let me make that clear. I don't mean like in the grand scheme of things, but I mean it matters because we want to understand what Scripture says, right? That's what I mean, right? So I would argue that what sort of benefit would the original readers have gotten for that particular interpretation? I think that's the way to go when people try to make Revelation about some modern phenomenon, is what benefit would it have had to those original readers if it's talking about something, only talking about something 2,000 years later? I think that's very difficult to answer. Yeah.
The obvious point when I read Revelation is, that don't mean a whole lot to me because I wouldn't know it was actually written to at that time.
Right.
It was perfect, or he wouldn't have written it.
Right. It's just like the New Testament epistles. How many New Testament epistles are written to the University Church of Christ? I don't see any. Maybe your Bible has some. If it does, I want to see it because it's very different than mine, right? Now, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. That doesn't mean that we think, oh, this is just a historical document and it's interesting to read its history but doesn't have any relevance. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that's where we should start, and that's why I'm doing what I'm doing as we go through Revelation. All right, so enough stalling. Let's talk about verse 18. All right, this calls for wisdom. Let anyone with understanding. You see a few scriptures a few statements like this in Scripture, and I think when we see them, that's an indication here's something difficult. Right? I really believe that. Okay, the number is the number of a person. I think what that means is whatever this number means, it has to do with an individual. Okay. So, the first thing we need to understand is that in Greek and Hebrew, the letters have numerical value. Each one of them does, right? So how do you make a number in the Bible? So if you read a number in Hebrew, it's a combination of these letters. It's not separate like we have it, right? We have letters and numbers separated. Greek and Hebrew doesn't. Latin doesn't, which, by the way, Roman numerals. What is that? That's a mixture of Latin letters. Same thing with Hebrew and Greek, right? So when we understand that, then maybe that'll open things up for us, okay? The text says that those who have understanding need to calculate it. This is gematria, which, by the way, is usually referred to as a Hebrew way of figuring these numbers and adding these numbers up. But actually, it's a Greek word. We get our word geometry from that word. Anyway, you probably don't care about that. But anyway, this is the adding up of the numerical value of letters. Okay, first of all, the word beast in Greek, so it's probably going to be better if I do it like this. So this is the Greek, therion. That's the Greek word for beast. All right? Well, when you transliterate it into Hebrew, Hebrew is left to right, so we don't go that way, we go that way. It's tarion or something like that, right? Tarion. Well, when you add up those letters, 400 plus 200 plus 10 plus 6 plus 50, 666. That is clearly what's going on, right? You may say clearly, yeah, right, okay. Does this make sense? Okay, I don't really see a lot. Doesn't? Okay, no, it doesn't. Okay, thank you for being honest. Let me try it again then. So, the word translated beast in Revelation 13 is therion, right? Transliteration is when you take the consonants, in this case because it's Hebrew, of one language and transfer them over to the consonantal value in our language, or in this language is Hebrew, right? So this is the T, it's actually theta, but T, this is T. This is R, this is R, etc. Does that make sense? Okay, all right, good. All right, so when you take these letters, so here's the T, 400, this is R, 200, Yod, well, it's Y, but 10, Vav, V, 6, and then this is the final Nun, is 50, 666. All right, is that clearer? Okay, thank you. Thank you. All right, good. So, he's doing this play on the Greek word for beast. He's translating it, or transliterating it to Hebrew, right? So, beast, basically. Is that all there is to it? No, there's not. That's cool, right, I think. But there's more to it than that, because he says it represents a person. So who is this person? Well, this is somewhat controversial, but it is, and that's because you can spell, Kaisar, but also Nero in more than one way in Hebrew. So that's where scholars disagree about this. But I think it's just too much of a coincidence. All right, so this is Kaisar, Caesar in English, right? So in Hebrew, it's Kaisar Neron, Nero. In Hebrew, you would add that in probably, that final in. Well, when you add this up, Kaisar's 360, Neron is 306, that equals 666. I mean, to me, the coincidence, that's too much of a coincidence, right? I think that's what this means. Now, I'm wondering if anyone, I think it's in the King James Version, or if anyone has a footnote that says 616 instead of 666. Anybody have that in their Bible? Okay, good. Yeah. It's either a footnote or it's in the main text. Well, what about 616? How can it be that? Well, when you add those numbers up, Kaisar, which is the same as here, but then instead of Neron, it's just Nero. That's what it would be in Latin, and that adds up to 616. Again, either way, in other words, either textual variant is talking about narrow, right? That's just, again, because of the connections with narrow so far, this is just too much of a coincidence. This has got to be what he's talking about, right? So, again, it's a reference to this narrow redivivus myth that we talked about before, that Nero's coming back. Here, I think he's back in the form of Domitian. So it's a rulership like Nero. Now, here's the question. I've had to spend all this time trying to explain it, and I'm not entirely sure I did a good job. It's difficult, right? Why has this got to be so difficult? Maybe that's the question. Why does he have to use gematria? Which, I'm not trying to insult anybody, but I would assume for some people in here who may not have that much experience, it may be the first time they've ever heard the word gematria, right? May not ever heard of it, ever heard of this method. Like, why is it so difficult? And I think the answer is that the author, first of all, his audience would have been much more familiar with everything that I've just shared with you, right? I would be willing to bet that probably not everyone in those congregations could have figured this part out, but somebody could have, and presumably he could have explained it. I say presumably because it's a patriarchal society. He probably could have explained it, right? Somebody could have. But again, why use gematria? And that's because by using this code with these numbers, it can express a lot of different things. One possibility is the Greek phrase, he killed his own mother, which, remember, I talked about that last time. Nero killed his own mother. Guess what that adds up to? 666. Is that what he meant too? So it means so many different things. I think that's possible. That's why he's using it, right? And this is something that's fairly common in antiquity, not just in Judaism, although there's not a whole lot of evidence of Judaism from around the time. But there are a couple of inscriptions at Pompeii. Remember, we watched the video about Pompeii a few classes ago. Well, fortunately, that has preserved this ancient city in some ways. There are a couple of inscriptions. One of them is from this guy talking to his female friend. He says, "I love," and instead of her name, it's got 3 numbers, right? So you can express a lot just by using the numbers. That's why I think he's using it. All right, so what does all this mean? The land beast is associated with Nero. Nero also is associated with the imperial cult. And all this really points again to Domitian and his reign. And it's almost like, so there's a larger framework too, and that is Nero's reign. Nero's representation is paradigmatic for any government that's against the followers of God too. So I think that on the bigger scale, that's what this is, right? So, any questions or comments about that? Clear, what do they say? Clear as mud, right? Is that right? Mud isn't clear, in case you... Sorry. All right, so if there are no questions or comments, that'll be it. We'll see you guys Wednesday. Thank you.